going to get started here? All right. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this year's Wesson lecture, Fixing the Climate, Strategies for an Uncertain World. My name is Nancy Thresher, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at Stanford, where I work at the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society and the Stanford Doerr School for Sustainability. Before handing it over to Professor Chris Field, who'll give an overview of tonight's talk and our impressive speakers, I want to say a few words about the Wesson lectures themselves. The Wesson lectures on problems of democracy were endowed by Robert Wesson, who died in 1991 at age 71 after a long career in foreign service and academia. He served in the US Foreign Service in Brazil and Colombia and taught at Bates College, Oxford University, and at UC Santa Barbara. He ended his career with an appointment as a senior research fellow at the Hoover Institute here at Stanford. In endowing this annual lecture series, Robert Wesson wished to stimulate students, scholars, and the public to think through pressing issues in democratic governance. To that end, the series brings to campus each year people who have made great contributions to the understanding and improvement of democratic institutions. It was important to Robert Wesson that these lectures touched on issues not only theoretical, but practical. In that vein, it is hard to imagine a more pressing and practical issue facing us today than climate change, nor one that so systematically threatens our political structures. To introduce this topic and our speakers, I'll now turn to Professor Chris Field, who is the Perry L. McCarty Director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment and the Melvin and Joan Lane Professor for Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies here at Stanford. Professor Field is a preeminent climate scientist whose work spans topics from fire and flood risk to global ecology and economics. He was also co-chair of Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a member of the Board of Directors for the World Wildlife Fund, and is on the Board of Trustees for the California Academy of Sciences. We are honored to have him here with us tonight to introduce our Wesson lecture speakers.
Thank you, Nancy. I should say I'm no longer the co-chair of Working Group 2 of the IPCC. I was thrilled to serve in that, but it was a crushing job, and I can't express how happy I am to no longer be doing that. But I am thrilled to be here in order to introduce you to two people who really moved the needle on climate and are going to discuss how they've done that today. Pleasure to introduce Charles F. Sabel. He's a professor of law and social science at Columbia Law School. And previously, he was the Ford International Professor of Social Science at MIT. And Chuck's earlier work focused on the crisis of mass production and its implications for the regulation of markets and the macroeconomy. His more recent work develops pragmatist, and that's going to be the sort of underlining dimension of the stuff we'll talk about today, ideas into the general conception of democratic experimentalism, with particular attention to regulation, the provision of complex social services, and contracting under uncertainty. Chuck's current projects include the elaboration of experimentalist or incremental solutions to apparently global problems. Examples include trade and climate change, which we'll be talking about today, the current transformation of U.S. administrative law in the face of uncertainty, and new models of economic development in a world of industrial production in the context of globalization. David Victor, close colleague, is professor in Peter Cowie Center on Global Transformation Chair in Innovation and Public Policy. That is the world's longest professorship title. At the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. He's also an adjunct professor of climate, atmospheric science, and physical oceanography at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and co-director of the UCSD Deep Decarbonization Initiative. And prior to joining the faculty at UC San Diego, David was a professor at the Stanford Law School. David's research focuses on regulated industries and how regulation affects the operation of major energy markets. Much of his research is at the intersection of climate change, science, and policy. He's been active across the climate and energy policy space, including roles as an IPCC convening lead author. He's done with that too. And member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Energy. Over the last few years, I had the distinct pleasure of working with David as a co-chair, along with Pat Vincent Kalan and Mustafa Santiago Ali, on a report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences called Forging Climate Solutions, which takes another cut at developing pragmatic, incremental, experimentalist solutions to environmental problems. The project with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences was a ton of fun, but it also gave me a unique opportunity to interact with David, gave me a deep respect for his pragmatism and creativity, but also and especially for his ability to synthesize complex, messy subjects into really clear, actionable priorities. And that's what I see so much in the work that Chuck and David are going to talk about today, an approach to one of the world's most challenging topics that has so far defied the kind of progress that we need to see and really cries out for solutions that work. And I think that's where we're headed today. The list of David's books goes from the really pessimistic to the really optimistic. He wrote a book called The Collapse of the Kyoto Protocol, 2001, Global Warming Gridlock in 2011. And what's really encouraging is that the most recent two books have really focused on the optimistic side of climate, and that's where we have the opportunity to go today. So it is a distinct privilege for me to introduce Chuck Sabel and David Victor.
So thank you for the kind introduction, and greetings to all. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I mean, it's a true pleasure, actually. In part in response to Inês's questions, in response to some guesses about what your interests might be, I'd like to frame the book, start off by framing the book against the backdrop of the idea of experimentalism, because it's, we assume it's a fairly novel, if not a weird notion to many of you, and so it could be useful to explain what it is and how, in particular, it shaped three large themes. I'll call them plasticity, the malleability of the earth, the idea of uncertainty, and the nature of democracy itself. Three themes that feature importantly in the book, though because the book is focused on climate and is focused on solutions, there's no scope in the book to explore the implications of those ideas, much less connect them fully to the pragmatist experimentalist backdrop. So I'm going to fill in just as much of that as I'm guessing will be helpful to you for the discussion that goes forward. So let me start by saying what experimentalism is. It's a pragmatist idea that goes back to the 19th century pragmatists, Peirce, James, John Dewey. And it has, in crude form, three essential components. The first idea is that the universe is a pluriverse. The world we know is only one, what's currently accessible of a vast number of other worlds whose exact existence we ignore, but whose persistence and availability in some way to knowledge we embrace. So there's more in the world than we ever can know. That's the first point. The world is always full of surprises. So that's the first idea. The second idea is that what we know at any one moment is a kind of uneasy amalgam of explicit theories and background habits and assumptions that reinforce our theories, play into the fabric of our beliefs, but whose exact nature and standing, verifiability is unknown to us. So we don't know, don't know all there is, and even what we don't know, We don't know perfectly in the sense that we can't give at any one moment a deliberate, fully conscious account of it. The third idea is the way we discover these limits to our knowledge is by having problems. Running into circumstances where this skein of conscious theoretic ideas and background assumptions run out, and our efforts to pursue what seem like familiar goals result in failure. And so we recognize that we have to learn something, and it's not clear whether the issue is repairing some defect in things that we know about the world which will turn out to be true of that world and serviceable to respond to the problem, or things about that force us to contemplate the existence of one of these pluriverses outside the world we don't know. Okay? So that's the view of the world from the point of view of pragmatism and experimentalism. I think a lot of that could be translated into the banalities of late 20th century history and philosophy of science. There's a way, or not just one way, plenty of ways of making pragmatism compatible with this, and many of the leaders in the history philosophy of science have been in one form or another pragmatists. So there's nothing, in that sense, there's nothing exotic about this. Now, pragmatism does not have a view about how you solve problems as a pragmatist. It's a view about how you'll encounter problems and what the goal of problem solving will be, and the inevitable limits of repairs to the defects in our knowledge. But actually going about solving problems, we're supposed to, that's just our response. We're going to figure out how to do that on the fly. And a large part of the book is devoted to explaining how these background ideas can inform the construction of institutions that allow us to solve the concrete problems that we face. So that's very, very generally the connection. Now, I want to link pragmatism to three concerns that are pervasive in the book, not the institutional concerns. They'll emerge in the course of discussion. But I want to connect them to three large concerns in the book, just so you see what kind of what's at stake, if you like. So first, this idea of plasticity. The brain is the classic example of organic plasticity. It responds to stimuli, it rewires itself. So the recombinability of reality, the susceptibility to recombination, is what we mean by plasticity. Now, why do we need a notion of plasticity to talk about climate change? Let me illustrate the necessity by just reminding you of two background ideas about the nature of progress, two ideas about how to think about climate change that have not worked out, and then you'll see why we're at least in search of an alternative. The first and most obvious is the 19th century view that, yes, nature is plastic. We can do whatever we want. There are no limits. It just whatever, that's what human mastery of the earth means, is that we can subordinate nature to our will, and that the plasticity is infinite. Basically, we're only at war with ourselves. Until we've figured out how to overcome our internal inhibitions, we won't be able to transform nature. When we do that, we will. That obviously seems like an insane idea today. I mean, literally, the idea that we could have spent generations in investing in technologies that, completely unbeknownst to us, at least for decades in the beginning, could destroy our civilization. That doesn't sound like the kind of mastery of nature supposed in the idea of human mastery of nature. So there's some interaction that's completely that's not captured by that. Here's another view of the current situation, the opposite extreme. It's the commonplace view, especially among economists, and economists are by far the most influential group among social scientists, in fact, among anybody, in defining most of the reaction to climate change, official policy reaction, climate change up till now. The view from the point of view of economics is it's just an externality. Carbon was mispriced. We didn't appreciate the true costs of emitting carbon. There's this terrible climate problem. And now if we get the price right, everything will be okay. And the issue is essentially the politics of making the carbon price the right so that we avoid the externality. Now, that hasn't worked, and it trivializes the problem. It trivializes the problem because what's at stake is not a matter of garbage collection. It's not a matter of more efficient waste disposal or substituting a dirty input for a dirty input by a clean input. The problem is we have to reinvent most of the core technologies of our world. Think of the electrical vehicle and green steel and green concrete to come, and redoing the farming systems I mean, this is an enormous undertaking. It's not a question of leaving everything intact and substituting, and we have no vocabulary for talking about that. Maybe because if we actually said it and said, oh, by the way, to save the planet, we have to transform it, one reaction would be, wait, you're the people that just are destroying the planet by your inability to attend to consequences, and now you're claiming, oh, sorry for the mistake, we're going to fix it. Instead, there's this much more modest idea, but no one is fooled. No one is fooled, and much of the mounting opposition to green interventions comes from people who see how deeply decarbonization will reach into and transform their daily lives. The Gilets jaunes, that's not an accident. That's when you have more and more people living on the edge, on this economic edge, and you capriciously, that thoughtfully from the point of view of decarbonization, capriciously from the point of view of people who suffer the effects, suddenly change their prices, just reducing the externality, ma'am, their lives go up in smoke, or threaten to. And that they're aware, in a way that the discussion of externalities obscures, that this is a fundamental change. Okay, so against that backdrop, the idea of experimentalism allows us to at least think, okay, we live in a world that we've made. We don't make it entirely. We have to investigate it in order to see how we can change it. And that can be, in some measure, a collective and responsible endeavor. That's a different way of thinking about the problem of climate change. Okay, now, the question of plasticity goes directly to the problem of uncertainty. Most of the decision models we have are based on the idea of rational decision making, which assumes the ability to calculate costs and benefits, which assumes the stability in the costs and benefits, which assumes the predictability of outcomes, which altogether is the opposite of uncertainty. Uncertainty is not being able to assign probabilities to outcomes, and that's what you're doing when you're engaged in plasticity and world making. It's not what you're doing when you're making a cost-benefit analysis, but the fact of the matter is we're actually engaged in uncertainty. Pragmatism, in the book, we have a quite elaborate discussion of how to retool incentives so that they use uncertainty as a motor to instigate investigation. And we have many examples of that. We'll come back to them later. But the key point is that uncertainty is a master variable in this. When you're talking about remaking the world, you cannot be talking about anything, and you self-evidently can't have a blueprint for the world you're making unless you're a revolutionary and think you've read it in a book somewhere. under those circumstances, you have to acknowledge uncertainty right from the beginning, and pragmatism helps us do that by assuming fallibility. Another way to put the pragmatist idea is that it allows for knowledge creation, but never forgets the fallibility of the result. That's another way of talking about the pluriverse. It's a universe in which fallible current ideas may be amended to reveal worlds we know. So fallibility is indispensable. Fallibility is the precondition for dealing with uncertainty. Only when you recognize fallibility do you take actions which allow you to explore the uncertainty and to correct mistakes before they become embedded the way they did in the case of climate change. Uncertainty is connected to another core theme in the book, because uncertainty is the solvent of expertise. Under real uncertainty, it's not that expertise goes away, it's not that expertise becomes irrelevant and everybody is equally an expert, but experts have two fundamental roles. One is to be expert in the sense that they have the authority, they have been certified as competent to give definitive answers to problems within their range of competence. That's what an expert is. You're licensed to give authoritative advice within your domain of expertise. Under uncertainty, you cannot give authoritative advice. The other role of expert becomes important. The other role of expert is organizing investigations to figure out what is going on and what it is that has to be learned. In other words, to explore the uncertainty. So we need to shift from the idea of the expert as the repository of established knowledge to the expert as the leader of groups of persons with many different kinds of knowledge exploring this uncertainty. And COVID is a good example of what happens when you pretend you don't have to do that. It's a really good example of where experts swallow their own medicine, thinking we're expert, and then have to change the dictates of expertise every 2 months. So we need a world in which experts can, okay. Now, all this goes finally, last point, to influence on democracy. Because democracy is the way we make collective decisions about our collective future. And if we're remaking the world, we are remaking our collective future. If we remake the collective future without indulging in democratic, obligating ourselves to democratic process, it's whatever its results, it's tyranny. So the question is, what's going to happen to democracy? Now here, in preparation for this lecture, I actually went and looked at what people have been writing about the effect of climate change on democracy, and I'll just report these findings very briefly so that we can go on to the view that's expressed in the book, and I'll leave you to figure out what you think of these. So one common response is to think, this is true of, especially among a certain kind of progressive, my friends, is to think climate will release masses, climate change will release masses of refugees fleeing climate-impacted zones. They will be denationalized. They will be persons without a state. They will be thrown back into the situation of the immigrants of Central Europe after the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, walking around stateless, looking for a nation to call home. The proliferation of these meandering groups, the threat they pose to the existing societies, will lead in place after place to the declaration of states of emergency. And all of you who know any modern political theory know that you can't say states of emergency without thinking of Carl Schmitt. And if you have avoided that, there's no need to make up for the gap, but Carl Schmitt is the obligatory reference here. And with Carl Schmitt comes the idea a dictator for the state of global exception. So one serious idea about what the effect of climate change on democracy will be, in order to respond, we need a global green leviathan. There's a book with the title, The Green Leviathan. And the ideas are crazy, the argument is extremely thoughtful. So that's, no, very common. We're in a university after all. So all right, that's one idea. A second idea, much more timid, is to say, don't worry, we built a welfare state, we'll build an environmental state with regulators and all the accoutrements. The problem is our welfare state, and along with many of our other state institutions, are in crisis. It's not that we have a solid foundation to build on, it's that in building we have to rebuild. And this will be either a great opportunity to rebuild or our final failure, or another failure in a line of terrifyingly recent failures to adapt democracy to circumstances we face. So, in the background of the book, there are examples of this. If you follow the book carefully, there's a discussion of water use in Ireland, which is one example. There are a bunch of examples in the book. There's another notion emerging from lots of places, actually, that the nature of democracy itself is changing, not principally, but also in part because of climate change. The argument is that representation in a world of uncertainty, change is incessant. The idea of electing representatives to write laws which will be stable for a long time, then transformed into administrative rules which will be stable for even longer, that idea is going by the board. No one imagines you can have democracy without representation, but it will have to be complemented in this theory more and more by accountability mechanisms built into the interaction between citizens and the providers of public goods, the state and other entities. So it's not the election of the representative and the vote of the representative in a deliberative body that matters. What matters is the actual character of co-decision between the users of public goods and the producers of public goods. And you see a lot of tendencies in this direction in things like school reform and the use of mobility. I mean, if you talk to city planners, they're way ahead on these kind of things. So, again, mentioning a feasible solution is different from having the solution. And the point here is just to help you understand the background intellectual formative elements that led us in the direction of this book. I will say to my mind, one of the greatest compliments we received on this book was from a reviewer in a journal called Contemporary Pragmatism. I'm not a subscriber. And the reviewer said, this is really pragmatism. This is, oh, look, and this, and this, oh, pragmatism all the way. And they only cite Dewey once. To me, that was just as at the artifactual level, at the craft level of just producing a result, the aim of the book was to introduce these ideas without distracting the reader from the real point of the book, which is addressing the climate issue, and that's what we're going to turn to now.
Well, thank you very much. It is great to be back here at Stanford. Chuck's given some of the intellectual history and origins of this book. About a third of the book is theory. About a third of it is retelling history. There's a lot of history that's very familiar where we think we know what happened. We've spent a lot of time on it, and we have written new histories to show you, hopefully, history isn't quite what you think it is. And a third of it is applying to climate. And I want to now just say three things really about the application to climate by reflecting on some things that we think are kind of standard wisdoms in the field. And as is clear from Chuck's remarks, uncertainty And the decision-making involved in governance runs throughout the book. First, we know what to do. How many times have you heard that around the climate change problem? We know what to do. We know what technologies to apply. If people just had greater political will, or if they weren't idiots, or if these interest groups were not organized to block us and so on, we would go out and we would do the right thing. So I'm going to try and dismantle all of those arguments because I think they're all wrong. We don't know what to do. Even in areas where almost all of our models agree, like an economy that decarbonizes is an economy that electrifies. Not 100% of people don't agree on anything in a university campus. That's what's so great about a university campus up to a point. But that's an axiom in energy and climate policy modeling. Okay, so that tells us we know what to do, which is we need to electrify like mad. We need to make clean electricity. But how do you actually build and operate a grid at scale that's double or triple current power consumption and keep current levels of reliability or whatever the right types of reliability are? We actually have no idea. Because even if the technologies didn't change, and the technologies, of course, are changing, the context in which the grid operates is changing constantly as the configuration is altered and as we do new things with it. It's this kind of uncertainty. It's this irreducible uncertainty. Some people call it deep uncertainty. It's uncertainty where the right answers, or even workable answers, because right kind of gets in the way of thinking here, those answers are unknowable in the beginning without going off and trying things at scale. Things that allow you to push the technological frontier, there's a whole chapter in here about that, or things that allow you to learn how technologies you think you understand, or business practices you think you understand, or organizations you think you understand, how they operate at different kinds of scales. Contextual learning is the concept that we use in here. So why do you care about this? You care about this because the uncertainty, the irreducible uncertainty around what do you actually do to fix the climate, to make deep reductions in emissions, that uncertainty is not a license to do nothing. And in fact, the argument that we're making in the book is the uncertainty is one of the motivators for not all firms, not all governments, but some to go off and run experiments. And those firms and governments are motivated not just because, gee whiz, we're sitting around, we don't know what to do, and we're bored, so let's go try some experiments, but they also face what in contract law is called a penalty default. They face an extreme harmful outcome that is conditional upon effort. For example, look at all the oil and gas companies in Europe that have been working on climate before the American firms, much to the chagrin of some of their shareholders. Why are they doing that? Because you cannot be a European headquartered oil and gas company and not be in one way or another be seen as taking the climate change problem seriously. Dragging your feet is riskier than going off and doing things that cost money, that involve risk, and potentially are catastrophic if you handle them very poorly. That's not just an oil and gas phenomenon. That's an electric power phenomenon. Chuck mentioned cement, where we have now 36 or more, depending on how you count, startups that are all kind of clean cement startups looking at alternatives for clinkers. Look at what's happening in steel with a variety of different technologies around zero carbon or near zero carbon. Zero is a very small number, but near zero carbon emission steel. Why are these firms doing this? Why are some governments like Sweden doing this? It's because of this existential risk to them that they would lose license to operate, politicians would be voted out of office, CEOs would be removed, and so on. So this is very, very important because under these conditions of an extreme incentive, you have an incentive to go search for alternatives. And if you knew what the right answer was, or if you had taken decision theory and you said, I'm very clever, I don't know exactly what the right answer is, but I know there's some uncertainty there and I know the range, the probability distribution function, then I could run a portfolio, and then against that portfolio I can make a series of investment decisions. But if you don't even know how to draw the PDF before you do the investments, then you have to have a different kind of strategy where you're searching for alternatives, you're searching for solutions, and you have to be super careful that your search is not overweighted to the median, but it's actually looking out on the tails of distribution. So that's the first thing I wanted to say by way of, what do these ideas mean for fixing the climate? The first one is that we don't know what to do, but that's not a recipe for inaction. The second is I want to pick up on this concept of plasticity and talk about it in a slightly different way, which is about politics. In a world where some firms and some governments are out there changing facts on the ground, that's a world where when some of those new facts work, also known as creating new businesses, new employment opportunities, and so on, then you, in effect, create a set of interest groups that want more of that. And those interest groups may not know in the beginning that they're going to exist. They may not know exactly where they're going to want to create their alliances and so on. But that because of this penalty default as a motivator and because of the search for alternatives, you then see the beginnings of these new possibilities, these new industrial futures. And done well, industrial policy, good jobs policies, that's what they should be. Done well is a big caveat. Whenever you begin a sentence by saying, or you add the clause, if done well, in the middle of it, you know there's a lot lurking in the clause. And so I'm sure we'll have a chance to unpack that a little bit. Maybe that's the Inflation Reduction Act of the United States, maybe not. Maybe that's European industrial policy, maybe not. Maybe that's the Japanese, kind of classic Japanese or Korean industrial policy, maybe not. You have to design this in a way that's done well. And in particular, a lot of the book is about institutions. What are the nature of the institutions that can really search a wide range and then learn quickly what's working, what's not working. There's a big role for expertise in there. This is not a kind of straight up book about democracy where everybody has the same vote, as it were, about which kind of grid configuration works better than others. There is a special role for experts, as Chuck was talking about in his remarks. So that's the second thing I wanted to say with regard to how do you take these big ideas and turn them into a plan, as it were, a pragmatic strategy around climate. One of them is recognizing that we don't know the right answers, and so we have to search. The second is to think about this as a theory of politics, that the politics that seem daunting early on become easier because of the way interest groups get created. And the last thing I'll say is about Paris. The area where this book and the writing changed the most was in our vision of Paris. It's still basically positive about Paris, and Chris in his introduction said one of my first books was about the collapse of the Kyoto Protocol, so you have a sense of my views about Kyoto. The history of international cooperation on climate has not all been positive. Actually, most of the time we've spent wasting our time because we didn't have the right theory about uncertainty and about the motivators for action. Paris is an umbrella under which this kind of experimentalism can take place. Nowhere in the language of the Paris Agreement does it say we're running an experimentalist governance system. But in our language, that's the charitable view of Paris, which is that it's an umbrella of legitimacy and helps create penalty defaults and motivations. And then some coalitions of the willing, we used to call them, or clubs, organized typically by sector, can go off and run these experiments. And that's actually working. There's a lot of good news in the overall Paris process. It's interesting to note that this seems very complicated. This actually happens all the time. One of the most prominent, arguably the biggest success story in international environmental governance is the Ozone Accords. And the argument we make in the book, in fact, we use this as the set piece for the opening chapter of the book. The argument we make in the book is that the reason ozone worked is precisely because diplomats they used very ambitious goals and targets to help motivate action, and then decentralize the process of search for solutions, and then re-centralize that knowledge in the form of peer review and figuring out which technologies worked and didn't by sector and so on. And that process is not bottom up and it's not top down. It's a mixture of decentralization and centralization. And those are the kinds of institutions that make things work. Let me close by just remarking, we've talked about our book in several different settings. We've never been invited until today to talk about the book in a series whose organizing principles are around democracy and governance. We've always been invited by climate people, and not to disparage climate people, I'm one of the climate people, I see many climate people, but it's exciting to be able to do this because the book really is about a larger set of themes about how information is organized, about how we change the status quo, and that's a big challenge in climate, but climate is not the only challenge of that type. So thank you very much.
And so with that, we'll start this conversation. And first and foremost, my name is Inês Azevedo. I'm an associate professor in energy science and engineering. And I also serve as the co-director for an initiative between the Precourt Institute for Energy called Bits and Watts. Please go ahead.
Now, this is a check. This is a test of our capacity to allocate scarce resources.
There you go.
I'm just going to.
Okay. I'm gonna,
And I'll just start by saying that this book really achieved a lovely goal of combining fairly abstract ideas and theory, combining it with several case studies and history, and provide guidance on a path for the future with some potential solutions. So it really describes something that can be quite helpful to a wide range of readership. So before delving into some of the chapters, I would love to hear from you. How did this come about? How did you meet, and how did you have the idea for this book? And how much did it took to bring it to completion? Would you write the same book if you were restarting today?
oh goodness. I think it's 2013 or so. We were in a seminar together at Brown University, and my family just had a young baby, so I didn't go there. I joined by remote. And as often happens, people were asked to write memos. And both Chuck and I, who didn't know each other, we'd been at MIT at the same time, we wrote memos on complementary themes about how do you make transformative changes in the economy when you don't really know what to do, and then how do you design international agreements about that? And so I think it's possible we hijacked that seminar because there were a lot of other people in the room, but mostly you and I talked back and forth at each other. And next thing we knew, we had written, in effect, the first paper, and we were starting to write a few chapters before we actually sat down in person.
And then when we got that far, we rewrote those chapters, the whole book, 3 or 4 times. Because it was, so though it was completely self-evident the minute we got together that we had deeply compatible ideas, this business about not knowing what you're doing, that doesn't just apply to the people whose problems we were describing. We had to really figure out what we meant. And David's reference to Paris is a good example because it was very unclear where Paris would stand in the thing. And in fact, let me use this as an opportunity to call attention to a gap in the book that maybe we're slowly being able to fill. A question some of you might have is, what's the mechanism? Is there a global mechanism to, supposing Paris is an umbrella under which a lot of the things we describe can occur and are encouraged. We think that's true. We think Paris has good effects, and it has this facilitating capacity, but it has no authority, and it's not directive in any deep way. And so the question is does a global transformation need a global direction? And I think we came in the course of the book to agree that this is direct transformation with directionality, but not under global direction. So there are lots of elements here that put decisions of the kind that David referred to, these penalty defaults, that say this is out, this is the direction we're going to go, and that encourage people to see the status quo as riskier than pursuing investigations. But there was no global coordination. Sometimes even within a supply chain or a sector, there's a combination of these baffles giving directionality, but no global direction until things begin to coalesce. So, and kind of I think in the end, we could have been clearer about that in the book, but we would have required us to see beyond quite where we are. So I just mentioned that because it's an example of something which was a kind of a theme in our collaboration and trying to figure out where we stood on this. I don't think we found exactly the right thing, and I think it's a deep question. It's a deep question if you're thinking about school reform, or do you need an architect, or do you need a set of search processes? And we're of the search process persuasion.
That's spot on. So in the book, Chuck and David start by providing a little bit of history, and they tell us about the Montreal Protocol and the Kyoto Protocol. And When we look now at those two instances and understand how different those environmental problems are, it is not surprising that the outcomes have been so different. But you'll be willing to walk the audience through, for those in the audience that are not as familiar with environmental policy, what were those two policies trying to achieve, and what made one a success and the other one a failure? So how do you contrast the Montreal Protocol and the Kyoto Protocol?
Maybe I'll start. Actually, what's stunning is how similar they look initially. Yeah, they're different problem structures a little bit, and climate's harder because it's more expensive, but there's a lot more effort than put into climate. Many of the same people negotiated the same agreements. To us, what's really striking about this is even with the same people really didn't understand the theory of why the ozone accords were so successful. And that was not, or maybe some people did, and that's why they designed climate the way they did. But in a nutshell, why did ozone work? Ozone worked because there were extremely strong, bold commitments, and that were backed by NGOs and by firms and so on. So there was a strong motivation to go off and experiment. But if you go back and do the history correctly, which is what I think we've done correctly in the book, at the time people didn't know what it was going to cost. There were not implausible but pretty wild estimates about the overall impact on GDP. The conventional wisdom is that ozone worked because we had tough goals and we just ratcheted them tighter and tighter and tighter. But when you look at the history, actually, some of the goals were relaxed when it turned out to be harder to meet some of the emission reduction or consumption reduction obligations. The reason it worked is because they designed a system, a set of institutions in there that encouraged experimentation, often allowed firms to actually collaborate. Some governments allowed firms to collaborate, and then quickly checked with expert review to see which of these were working and not, and then ratcheted tighter where that was possible and looser where it wasn't possible. And the implication for climate is we ought to be doing more of that. I think given what's happened over the last 30 years, you can't really put that into international law on climate. It has to be done outside the Paris framework in smaller groups that are more willing to be more flexible. What is your impression?
Well, I think, and correct me if I'm getting you wrong here, but I think you're expressing a certain kind of skepticism that we encounter frequently with this comparison, that the scope and the nature of the problems are so different that a solution to one doesn't count as evidence about the solvability of the other.
That's spot on. So the sources of emissions and where you need to limit the emissions in what was the scope of the Montreal Protocol is very distinct of the pervasive source of emissions everywhere across the economy in all sectors of energy, electricity, transportation, and so on. So the scope and what needs to be regulated is dramatically different between those two.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. And I think we actually concede that. But I don't think that's quite the right way to phrase the comparison. Because the issue is, supposing we just agree that Montreal was on a smaller scale, supposing the argument there could still be the argument, and it's the argument we make, that within that smaller scope, the nature of the problems encountered by Montreal were very similar. They were, as David started to mention, he left out, there was great uncertainty about the science. One thing that's often said is ozone science was established and climate science is still amidst of, kind of disputes and so on. But when we go back to the history, the ozone science was not at all settled. To the extent that it got settled during the moment when Montreal was actually ratified, and even then it remained unsettled. So that's the first thing. A second thing would be the problem of the problems of abatement are easier in Montreal. It's fewer firms, it's a few chemicals compared to massive emissions all over That's true. But that doesn't mean that the problems that had to be dealt with within Montreal were any less difficult in themselves than the problems. There were more of them. They were more diverse in climate. But if you look at the individual ozone problems, many of them were extremely daunting to the experts. We found all these surveys where they asked the experts, by how much can you reduce ozone? 40%, no matter how much you spend on it, no more, things like that. So if you compare apples to apples, that is, problem solve, or here's another way to phrase a hypothetical comparison. What would really address the issue is if somebody had actually built an ozone-style regime to cover part of the climate problem, and then you would, ideally, thinking like an economist here, you would take a comparable climate problem that was not treated by the ozone method, and then you'd look for some natural that doesn't exist. That would be the really fair way to do it. But our supposition is, and we don't see any reason to back off on this, that so far.
I'm not asking you to.
No. But let me add one thing which is very striking. It's not in the book, but I ran across this last summer. Some very clever graduate student, a chemist by training, wrote an excellent paper showing that if you take molecules of the same structure as the ozone-destroying molecules, and you look at what happened to the ODS molecules that were covered by Montreal as compared to the production of non-covered similar molecules, what you see is a dramatic drop only in the ODS molecules. So this was a highly targeted, specific regime that worked. Your questions will remain. Your question will remain fair until the end of time because we can't possibly do it. We can't possibly do the comparison, but it's I suppose the ultimate test will be if people adopt experiment. I hope this doesn't happen. The ultimate validation of your skepticism would be if people adopt experimentalist methods in climate and they fail miserably where they should have succeeded by Montreal standards. If that happens, give me a call.
Will do. So you provide several examples, 3 instances where there was a successful push on the frontiers of innovation. And those cases are the CARB policies for emissions in transportation, the development and implementation of scrubbers in the stack of coal power plants, and the formation of ARPA-E. Can you share a little bit more about those stories and those case studies, and why did you pick these 3 specific examples? What makes them so powerful as a way to communicate those frontiers innovation and how they were so important in the context of the U.S. policy?
So the 3 examples you have in mind are the e-vehicles, scrubbers, and what?
ARPA-E.
ARPA-E.
Sorry?
The DOE ARPA-E. That's the other
And
example.
ARPA-E.
Yeah.
So okay. So let me explain why this was done. I think that today's word is intentionally. There was intentionality in this. I mean, it wasn't just we. So in the background of the book, we're mindful that there's a fight going on about the pertinence of another set of governance distinctions. So we're talking about governance from the point of view of experimentalism, but most people think the issue is, well, the market or the state or some blend of those, and those are the real governance mechanisms, and the problem of climate is finding which of those mechanisms to apply. So we thought it would be interesting to take 3 indubitably successful cases where everybody thinks this worked and show that in the background, one involved seems to involve a market approach. One that would be the scrubbers with carbon, sulfur. so that was one, the assumption was bureaucracies don't work. Bureaucracies can't write rules. The state doesn't work, so we're going to give it to the market. The ARPA view was the opposite. We need long-term investment. Markets don't do long-term investment. We need the state. And CARB, the e-vehicles, the argument was, well, let's not get unbalanced. What about the New Deal synthesis of the strong regulator and market forces? Okay, so those are the choices, and everyone's agreed these are three successes. And we thought it would be unsettling to common opinion to discover that underneath all three of these iconic things, there was the same set of governance mechanisms that are orthogonal to all of those distinctions. So the wild claim, there are a lot of wild claims in the book that are kind of muffled as modest, reasonable claims. The modest claim is kind of wherever you see these giant successes, you're going to see experimentalism. That was the reason.
And let me just give you an example. We all know the case of sulfur very well. We use the market cap and trade system in the United States. When you go back and do the history properly, almost all the reduction, some of the reduction was made possible by fuel switching and railroad reform that's separate from experimentalism. The vast majority of the reduction came because experimentalism made it possible to lay the foundation for the technologies, scrubbers in particular, that could be used and operated reliably inside power plants to make big reductions in emissions. And this is how we use evidence throughout the book, is we're using it to show, here's a history that we thought we all understood, but actually the uncertainties were greater in the beginning and the role of experimentalism was greater.
So the book is called Fixing the Climate and Strategies for an Uncertain World. You end the book outlining open plurilateral agreements as one potential solution. So for the folks that haven't read the book yet, what are these OPAs? How would they work and how would they help with fixing the climate problem?
Okay, let me take a shot at this. So let me start off by saying that any discussion of the trade aspects of this is encumbered by the continued ghost-like existence of the WTO. So the question is, how do you get arrangements that could be WTO conforming, even though much does not conform to the WTO? So, but in the spirit of fair play, we wanted to play by the rules, and so we wanted to get so we put this in the form of a facility that is cognizable under the WTO. It could be put in other ways, and I just want to make that clear that accounts for a little bit of the complexity. Let me say what they are. So an open plurilateralist agreement is a club, or you can think of it as a club or a commodity committee. It's a group, typically of consuming and producing countries that for reasons of their own are convinced that greening in some domain is vital and imperative. It could be that they, as part of their general commitment to do this for public health and safety and to save the climate. It could be because they see benefits in green technology and so on. But there's going to be, people will come together and what will they do? The first thing they'll do is they'll agree on a set of very detailed rules under which goods produced according to those rules in any member country, any country member of the club, can be exported duty-free to any of the others, okay? Now, why are the rules detailed? The rules have to be detailed because the only difference between a green good and a dirty good is the way it's produced. You can't tell green steel from dirty steel by looking at the steel. You have to look at every step in the steel, obviously. But that means you need a regulation about what, okay, and that's very demanding. The first thing. The second thing is, so that's the first step. But that's just the beginning, because ideally, the members of the club wanted to expand, to the extent that they're concerned either with public health and the climate or the business proposition, they want this club to expand. And of course, it's to the benefit of the world that it do so. So they have to agree on a set of procedures to allow subsequent applicants to enter the club. These procedures themselves have to be of a certain kind, because we know from much experience that there are many idiosyncrasies, so that the best way to green steel in Turkey is likely to be somewhat different from the best way to green steel in Indiana. Okay, there'll be steel is steel, but they are different, and this is manifestly true with agricultural commodities, where sort of you can't use the same green methods in different places. There are these idiosyncrasies, they have to be reinvented again and again as you move from place to place. Therefore, you need a set of rules that will allow people to enter the club subsequently by doing something which meets the standards but does it in the way most appropriate to that entry. And ideally, they'll also get the technical assistance of the existing club members. Okay, so that's what an open, it's plurilateral because the members are agreeing. It's open because of this commitment to do this. And of course, the rules for entry, as subsequent candidates appear, their applications for entry force reconsideration of the existing rules. Oh, here's a different way to do it. Oh, no, here's a better way to do it than anyone thought. So an improvement on best practice. So the idea is, in 2 words, a green club for a particular commodity, emphatically open, and open to variant solutions that accommodate basically the diversity of countries and especially the global south.
And I know you want to go to questions, but if you're looking for good news in climate, this is now happening. It's happening in steel. It's happening, Maurice is more or less organizing it in shipping with the help of the International Maritime Organization. It's kind of happening in civil aviation a little bit with the help of ICAO, but mainly governments that are motivated. Last week, the new UK Jet Zero pledges are very, very ambitious in this area. And these are, cement, we talked a little bit about, these are the areas that should have been the hardest. We're actually seeing quite a lot of, at reasonable pace, progress. And then for economy-wide measures, the Europeans are in the lead with the border adjustment mechanism, which is a similar kind of logic, some differences, but a similar kind of logic. And so that's one of the reasons why the book is kind of a hopeful book, because it's offering a theory for how to get through these problems of deep uncertainty and actually creating incentives to be doing more. And then when you look at the real world, you know, as many people have commented, 15 years ago we were on track for 5 degrees C of warming. Now we're on track for maybe 2.5, 2.8 degrees of warming. So that's not 2, but it's not 5. And some of it is the new theory of change that's at work here.
Very good. So I would like to move on to open to questions from the audience too. I'm happy to keep going and ask you more questions, but any questions from the audience? And there is the mic there, so if you want to go ahead, we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm curious if you would refer to the recent decision in Dubai, the so-called UAE consensus.
Please use the mic.
Or stand a little closer, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the recent
There you
decision in
go.
Dubai at the COP28, which the so-called UAE consensus, whether you see this as progress or not. In other words, you were disappointed, I think specifically David was disappointed, like all of us in Kyoto, encouraged by Paris. There's been 2 different narratives about what happened at Dubai. One says it was a takeover by the oil companies, and one saying, no, we got, for the first time, real tough emissions and mitigation goals. So I kind of wanted to hear your read on that in the context of the book, of course. And congratulations.
I was there. Some of other people in the room were there too. My read is that neither of those interpretations is correct. The oil companies were there, and an oil company hosted it, but they also know that they're under tremendous pressure to do something, including because they're concerned about export. You see some big green industrial export projects emerging in the Emirates with an eye to the European market. So I don't see it as a takeover by them. I also don't think that a document that is, 20 or 30 pages long, has some paragraphs that are badly in need of more punctuation, is really telling us much by itself. It's not driving change, it's reflective of where we are. To me, the really big news in that agreement was that the list of technologies that were eligible, if you like, has gotten longer. And Chris Field mentioned this report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which includes an all of the above very strong recommendation. Let's use all technologies that care about carbon and not purity tests. There's a great example. Nuclear was in it, CCS was in it, along with a lot about renewables. That's, I think, the big news.
Oh, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Aryan. I'm currently a high schooler. Thank you so much for your talk today. You mentioned penalties as an example of motivators for change, but do you believe that businesses should also offer positive incentives to the masses, such as carbon points for extending the use of the products that we consume?
Well,
Business?
so we want to be clear about the extent to which, the way in which we're talking about penalties. There is I'll repeat, there's a kind of discussion of this in the book, so let me just emphasize the points that are relevant to respond directly to your question. So we're not talking here about standard penalties, the way you might if you were designing a regulatory regime where you were going to deter a certain kind of undesirable behavior, and you assign, you assign clear penalties for that, and they're immediately practicable. We're talking about what we call, following some innovation or some device in contract law, a penalty default. Let me explain that. The classic example in contract law comes from divorce. You have a divorcing couple, and they know together better how to settle their affairs, however much they may be in distress at the moment. Their division of assets and so on is likely to make much more sense for them than anything the judge will impose, but they're not talking to each other, and so we don't know what they would make for themselves. So the judge says, look, if you don't talk to each other and come up with a better proposal, I'm going to follow the rules. And the rules say this, and it will horrify you. Go take a look. The motivation is not to get them to agree to a particular thing, but to exchange the information necessary for them to come to an agreement. Okay? So we've transported that, from the...
Minus the divorce.
minus the divorce, to as a regulatory technique, and we say, look, if you stick to the status quo and do nothing, which may be attractive because if you stick, others will stick, and so there'll be a de facto conspiracy of silence and inaction. If you stick to that, at the end of some time, we are going to impose some draconian penalty, knowing that it's draconian. Your alternative is to individually or collectively look for a solution. Tell us about emerging solutions. We'll integrate those solutions into incrementally increased standards. Those standards will be the guide for the industry in this. That's giving the directionality in the sense that we mentioned earlier. Okay? So the incentive then becomes, if I announce in advance, say I'm a maker of catalytic converters. I don't care what the ultimate price of the car is. I'm selling catalytic converters. I want the regulator to know that my catalytic converter will produce this diminution in emissions. So they integrate that into the standard. Some people will buy my catalytic converter. That's the immediate benefit to me. Others will find other ways of achieving. If that's too expensive, they let them find other ways. And out of that mass of innovation will come the next standard and the next and the next. So the penalty here is not the thing. It's not that we have the understanding and the penalty is to ensure compliance with our understanding of the solution. The idea is the reverse. We don't know. The penalty is designed to start the exchange among the people with the knowledge that leads. That's the...
I see. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we'll move on. Yes, sir.
So I think I would count as one of those grid experts that you kind of mentioned. But my question is more about the failure of the pricing model as a means of changing the climate. And I do have another question after that. But this question is about, so is an example of why the economist climate model, change model fails is that in the economy you have companies or corporations and that have an interest in selling more oil or fossil fuels or whatever, and so then they will do things to protect their stranded assets because that's what they're going to become. And then the second question is your role of experts. That it sounded to me like your experts should become like facilitators or referees in these different conversations about solutions.
Let me start. They do become to some degree referees, but let me start on the other question. If you know almost everything you need to know about the state of technology, about the cost, the externality, and things like that, you could imagine designing a market that would internalize the externality and get firms with large amounts of information to go off and behave properly. Quite often, once you're at that state of knowledge, there's a lot of different possible solutions here. Almost everything that's interesting, though, in deep decarbonization is not of that type. Let me give you an example. The most important and innovative carbon capture and storage project in the world today is happening in the North Sea. It's called Northern Lights. They collect carbon from a bunch of different industrial sources, Denmark, Germany, UK, Norway. They liquefy it, put it on ships, take it to Norway, they'll inject it underground there. Equinor, the state oil company, has developed enormous expertise, downhole expertise around carbon storage. Norway has the highest offshore carbon tax in the world. And despite having the highest carbon tax in the world, which is already at the outer edge of what's politically feasible, and is an enormous price signal, the firm could not justify moving ahead on FID with that project because the risks were too great, because it was a first-of-a-kind project. And so what you're trying to do is create an incentive and the capacity for firms that have the expertise to go off and take those risks and learn. And if you just think that the market price by itself is going to somehow allow firms to internalize all that future stream of payments and the benefits of that, that's not how real firms that are optimized to do one thing in the kind of Christensen's innovator's dilemma sense, learn how to do something different that has a totally different risk profile. And that's a good example right today of why just thinking about this as an externality, internalization of an externality doesn't actually lead to those outcomes. Do you want to talk about experts?
Yeah. So what I said was that experts have these two capacities: a repository of knowledge, and then there's the leaders of investigation. Not as referees of contending voices, though leadership consists in part of delegating responsibility to, or it's fundamental to leadership that the leader talks to all the people who disagree, and then you could say that the leader's role is what, to referee that? No, I don't think so, and so I don't know. I don't have I don't have a fully worked out model of what this new form of expertise is. I see it emerging in lots of places, often in response to emergencies or semi-emergencies. But the idea, this is not this is not an attack on the idea of expertise or the idea that there is some form of distinct and invaluable knowledge that can only be acquired through specialization. That's not part of this. Let me put it another way. David mentioned before that one of the institutional consequences of explorations of uncertainty under rapidly changing conditions is to construct institutions that are neither top-down nor bottom-up. Neither top-down because people at the bottom are constantly learning new things and they have to challenge the prevailing understanding. That has to be authorized and encouraged, but not just bottom-up, because it's the idea that people who are close to the problem or feel the problem therefore automatically have the answer is, of course, implausible. So you need a back and forth, mutual correction of these levels, and the same is true with interactions between persons with different kind of expertise and laypersons and experts. So the notion is building that kind of mutual accountability, not substituting, not replacing the idea of expertise with a referee.
Why did it take us 8 years to write, not buy this book? It takes you only a moment to buy the book. Why did it take us 8 years to write the book? This is a great example. In one of our early papers, we wrote about bottom-up, and then we were widely misinterpreted as, well, just decentralize the entire process.
Yeah.
That's a recipe for chaos. You have to decentralize the search for knowledge and then re-centralize what that means for goals and actions and so on.
Go ahead.
Hi, this is so interesting, and thank you so much for doing the work. I have, I'm going to try to sneak 2 questions in. One is...
We live in inflationary times.
Imagine a temporality where 1 is 2. So, 1, could you say a little bit about how you make people democratic citizens, so the Dewey education part, who are comfortable with irreducible uncertainty as part of the pedagogy for making people who can sustain these institutions? And the second, related, I think, is if you had a third author who is neither of you, right? Like a voice that is missing and gives you irreducible uncertainty, what would that third author be? What voice did you need in the room that could have shaped the work in a more multiplex fashion?
Interesting. Who would you pick as a third author?
I have no idea. I was hoping you were going to answer that question.
I will answer
Stall
the
for
question.
time.
I will answer
I'm
the
sitting
question.
right here.
I'm
I'm sorry, I had to do it. Go ahead.
Well,
go ahead.
You're on.
You're on.
Thank you for making this match. I'm at least half serious. I think Inês is actually at least a quarter serious. So, had we not met Inês here, a third author that would come to mind in the spirit of your question, and this is not, I haven't actually ever thought of it in the precise form you posed. It's a terrific question. But the people who come to mind, it's the same, not the same person, but the same, but the same spirit, afflatus, in 2 people. Archon Fung and Josh Cohen. Josh Cohen is a Stanford person. He's a local hero. He was a Stanford person. And why? Because both of them are deeply concerned with democracy and deeply informed about the tremendous, the kind of seething, roiling experimentation, desperate sometimes, kind of, but a kind of avalanche of experimentation with democratic forms, and because they both have their heads screwed on really right.
Let me your other question. My take is that the problem is not getting the average person to understand that sometimes you don't know where you're going. The average person's comfortable with the idea of search. If you want to know where's the really big challenge that's about to happen, it's with corporate leadership and banking and the NGO community. We have created the illusion that we know what the goal is, net zero. We know how to get there, and we now have a whole bunch of institutions like SBTI and to some degree CA 100 and plus and so on that are engaged in various kinds of road mapping activities. If you don't know where you're going and you don't know what's feasible, it might be easier or harder, mostly it's turning out to be harder, then the last thing in the world you want to do is be creating safe harbors around roadmaps. What you want to be doing is encouraging experimentation. So we're about to see a whole transformation is too strong a word. We're about to see a whole lot of pain around what goals are achievable. We're going to have all kinds of firms and governments that blank from the existing goals. How do you do that without just suffering political blowback? And then how do we move beyond this kind of insane road mapping mentality to something that's better reflective of the unknown?
Now, let me continue with that for a second, because I think it's in exactly the same spirit. I think it's just it's an understandable but very tricky moment where a lot of climate people, progressives generally, are part of Biden world, and as a result, domesticated in some complete, in a way that makes them neither informative to the rest of civil society, nor, so far as I can tell, actually influential in these debates. So I think, in the spirit of David's answer, I think we've created, and this is not just in climate, we've created a kind of world of NGOs, of social entrepreneurs, who are basically, in many cases, cut off from institutions, don't believe in institutions, think that they're, deep down, have the same recoil instinctivly from the idea of government intervention, except maybe in the case that it's actual state ownership, and even that, but really, really are still believe in what I can only call a neoliberal way, that the normal, guidance mechanisms through tax write-offs and things like this are the way to steer the economy. So I do think that that's the legacy of the, I don't want to be too harsh, but the
You're doing a pretty good job so far.
Yeah, I am doing a good job of not succeeding at being too harsh. So let me continue at not doing a good job. The pseudo-progressive world it's not helping, and it could become a problem.
So we're close to our time, but you've been patiently waiting. So please, let's go ahead, and you'll have the last question and the very brief response from the authors. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'll keep it quick. Hi, I'm Jessica. I'm an economics student here at Stanford with a focus on environmental policy. I wanted to ask about time lag. So I'm doing a bit of a research project right now looking at Barbados. They have a 100% renewable energy goal by 2030. Seems like all the pieces are in place. They have a very experimental mindset. They have a very motivated government. They have very good working relationships with the regulator, the utility, and the government. But things just don't seem to be moving quickly enough. So I would love to hear your thoughts on if you could change one thing about the way that political decisions are made, about the decision-making process. What would you change? And preferably something feasible and realistic.
What would we change? Sorry, I missed it.
What would you change about the political decision-making process?
To accelerate the transition.
And it has to be realistic. And you have to be not too mean to the progressives.
And that disqualifies
and
me.
you have 30 seconds.
Can I give you one thing, which is we need to institutionalize target setting and adjustment. I can't speak to the Barbados case in any detail, but quite often we set these really bold goals, and then it's hard. Like 100% that's a lot.
Yeah.
It's not. And we know this about behavior of renewable systems. I assume they're doing bagasse recycling, which makes it easier because it's dispatchable plants. But setting aside the technical stuff, we have, under the illusion that inviolable goals motivate more action, we've created too many inviolable goals and not given folks the space to make legitimate adjustments in those goals.
Okay, so I would, I completely agree with high level goal setting, that can't be reverse engineered into actual action. In other words, clean up the greenhouse gases and stop biodiversity and do all of these good things at once, set general targets for that, it just confounds action. So I agree with that. I'd recommend a change in politics that's in part already in motion in the Scandinavian countries. Here I don't mean Bernie Sanders' Scandinavian countries where everybody is above average and so on. I mean the actual Scandinavian countries that have, you know, big populist movements and, you know, lots of very familiar problems. What they're doing, the Dutch are doing in some measure, is recognizing that these problems are not one of the accompanying suppositions and deep problems associated with targets is they make you think that the solutions are going to be actually achievable in very short time horizons. That's different from thinking you'll be able to check whether you're making progress. But these goals tend to be, a long goal is 10 years. So I think when people start to realize that this is a generational project, maybe a multi-generational project, as they're beginning to do, and realize that governing coalitions, when in those countries, governments, especially minority governments, will sign a coalition agreement, they're beginning to think seriously about the idea that for some of these problems, we need more open-ended, long-lived agreements because things are tumultuous and there's exploration and there'll be reverses. And so I think that may be one harbinger of a longer range view compatible with democracy, but very different from what we're experiencing particularly now.
Thank you. So with that, let me invite Anne to the podium to close the event. And in the meantime, really, I'd love to thank Chuck and David for this lovely conversation. Anne?
Yeah, I mean, can we get a round of applause for our amazing speakers and Inês for moderating? Thank you all very much for coming to this event. I have a couple of announcements before we finish up. First, our amazing authors are going to be out front signing copies of their book, which are for sale outside if you would like to get a copy and get it signed. And second, we have a couple more events coming up at the Center for Ethics that people might be interested in. First up, on the 9th of May, that's next Thursday at 5 p.m., we're hosting Melvin Rogers, who's the author of The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African-American Political Thought. And on the 22nd of May, we have a discussion with Maisha Cherry, who has written a book called Failures of Forgiveness, What We Get Wrong and How to Do Better. All the information about those can be found online at our website if you'd like to register to attend. Both will be incredible events looking at the ways that broad racial discourse happens in our society and how to solve some of those problems. So once again, I'd like to ask you to thank our speakers, and hopefully we'll see you at future events for the Center for Ethics.